The parable of the hidden treasure, found in a single verse in Matthew 13:44, might be the shortest story Jesus ever told, but it contains a theological debate that has divided scholars for centuries. It is a story about a man who finds a treasure buried in a field, hides it again, and joyfully sells everything he owns to buy that specific piece of land. I wanted to unpack this specific parable today because its brevity is deceptive. It forces us to ask whether the story is about the cost of our own salvation or if it is actually about something entirely different.
It is a fascinating piece of scripture precisely because it is so compact. You have this massive theological concept, the kingdom of heaven, distilled into one sentence. To understand the impact of the story, we first have to look at the historical context of the ancient Near East. In the first century, the region of Judea was volatile. You had constant political upheaval, the heavy hand of the Roman Empire, and frequent localized conflicts. There were no secure banking systems for the average peasant. If someone accumulated wealth, burying it in the earth is the most logical way to protect it from thieves or invading armies.
So, finding buried treasure wasn't just a fairy tale trope for the original audience, it was a legitimate, albeit rare, possibility. If a wealthy person buried their coins or jewels and then died in a war or was displaced, that wealth simply stayed in the ground, waiting for a plow to hit it.
Exactly. For a first century peasant, stumbling upon a buried cache of wealth was the ultimate dream, equivalent to winning the lottery today. The parable relies on that visceral understanding and finding something life changing. The text specifically says, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. The man is likely a day laborer or a tenant farmer working someone else's land. He finds the treasure, realizes its immense worth, covers it back up, and liquidates his entire meager existence to purchase the field.
The ethical implications of that action always strike me as slightly questionable. He finds something valuable on another person's property, does not tell the owner, and uses his insider knowledge to buy the land. Does the historical context excuse that behavior, or is the parable intentionally using a morally ambiguous protagonist to make a point suff?
Rabbinic law at the time actually stated that if a worker found treasure while working on an employer's land, the treasure belonged to the employer. By covering it up and buying the land first, the man is ensuring his legal claim to the treasure once the transaction is complete. Jesus is not necessarily endorsing the man's ethics. Rather, he is using a relatable, highly pragmatic scenario to illustrate the sheer desperation and joy of securing something of infinite value. The focus is on the man's response, the radical joy that makes selling everything he owns feel not like a sacrifice, but like a bargain.
Let us get into the interpretations, because that is where the real tension lies. The traditional, most widely accepted reading of this parable is that the man represents the individual believer, and the treasure represents the kingdom of heaven, or salvation. If we follow that line of thought, what is the core theological message?
The traditional view, supported by theologians like John Calvin, is that the parable instructs believers to prefer the kingdom of heaven over the entire world. The hidden nature of the treasure suggests that spiritual truth is not immediately obvious to everyone. It requires revelation. Once a person discovers the truth of the gospel, they realize its incomparable worth. The act of selling everything represents the cost of discipleship. It aligns with other teachings in Matthew, such as Jesus telling his followers they must take up their cross, or the story of the rich young ruler who is told to sell his possessions.
I see a fundamental theological problem with that traditional reading. If the gospel is a free gift of grace, how can the parable suggest that we buy it? The man in the story literally purchases the field. If the man represents the believer, it implies that salvation is something we can buy or earn through our own radical sacrifice, which contradicts the core New Testament doctrine of salvation by grace alone.
That is a very astute critique, and it is the exact reason why a significant number of biblical scholars and theologians have proposed an alternative interpretation. Theologians like John Walvoord have pointed out that a believer has nothing of sufficient value to offer God. The gospel is not for sale. Furthermore, when a believer finds the truth of Christ, the natural response is to share it, not to hide it back in the dirt. Because of these inconsistencies, the alternative view flips the entire cast of characters.
Walk me through this flipped interpretation. If the man is not the believer, and the treasure is not salvation, who are they?
In this second major interpretation, the man who buys the field is Jesus Christ himself. In earlier parables in Matthew 13, Jesus explicitly identifies the field as the world. If we apply that same cipher here, the man is Christ and the field is the world. The treasure hidden within the world represents humanity, or the church, or in some dispensationalist views, the nation of Israel. Lutheran theologian David P. Scare argues that Christ is the one who gives up everything, his heavenly glory, and ultimately his life on the cross, to purchase the world and redeem the treasure within it.
That completely recontextualizes the emotion of the parable. Instead of it being a story about the heavy cost of human discipleship, it becomes a story about the joyous sacrifice of the divine. The selling all he had becomes the incarnation and the crucifixion.
Precisely. It aligns beautifully with passages like Philippians 2, which speaks of Christ emptying himself, or Hebrews 12, which says that for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. In this framework, the treasure is sovereignly chosen and highly valued by God. The act of hiding the treasure again before buying the field can be interpreted as the mystery of the church being kept hidden until the work of the cross was finished. Christ buys the whole world to secure the believers within it.
The contrast between those two interpretations is stark. One places the burden of action and sacrifice on the human, making it a moral imperative. The other places the action and sacrifice entirely on God, making it a declaration of divine love. Is there any room to synthesize these two views, or are they mutually exclusive?
They are often treated as mutually exclusive in academic circles, but I think they address different facets of the spiritual experience. The parable immediately following this one is the parable of the pearl of great price, which carries a nearly identical narrative structure. A merchant finds a priceless pearl and sells everything to buy it. Thomas Aquinas, in compiling the comments of early church fathers, noted that while the gospel comes without cost and is open to all, truly possessing heavenly riches requires a willingness to detach from worldly priorities. You cannot buy salvation, but accepting it inherently reorganizes your value system.
It seems the element of joy is the bridge between the two views. Regardless of who the man represents, the motivation for the sacrifice is not grim duty. The text says, "In his joy he goes and sells all that he has." If the man is the believer, the joy of knowing God makes worldly wealth seem irrelevant. If the man is Christ, the joy of redeeming humanity makes the suffering of the cross worthwhile.
Joy is absolutely the operative word in Matthew 13:44. The parable illustrates an overriding, ecstatic realization of value. If you consider the traditional view, it challenges the modern, comfortable approach to faith. It asks whether we view spiritual truth as a nice addition to an already full life, or as something so disruptive and valuable that we would gladly reorganize our entire existence around it. We are often too caught up in our own routines to recognize the divine initiative required to even see the treasure in the first place.
The idea that the treasure is hidden suggests a certain level of obscurity to spiritual truths. It is not a monument standing in the middle of a city square for everyone to see. It requires proximity, and perhaps a bit of luck or divine providence to stumble upon it in the dirt.
That hiddenness is a recurring theme in Jesus' teachings. He often spoke in parables specifically so that the deeper meanings would be obscured to the cynics and the arrogant, but revealed to those who were genuinely seeking. The kingdom of heaven does not look like a conquering empire with banners and trumpets. It looks like a peasant digging in a dusty field. It is subversive. The value is absolute, but it is entirely concealed from the casual observer.
Let us dig a bit deeper into the dispensationalist view you mentioned earlier, which identifies the treasure specifically as the nation of Israel. How does that reading handle the mechanics of the parable?
In that specific theological framework, often championed by preachers like Adrian Rogers, the argument is that the church is represented by the pearl in the next parable, while the buried theology is Israel. The rationale is that Israel was a treasure chosen by God, but at the time of Christ's arrival, they were suffering under Roman rule, essentially buried in the world. Christ comes, uncovers the treasure by presenting himself as the Messiah, but when he is rejected, the treasure is covered back up. He goes to the cross, buys the field of the world, and the promise remains that he will eventually return to unearth and claim Israel.
That is a highly specialized reading that relies heavily on a specific system of eschatology. It makes the parable a prophetic timeline rather than a moral or spiritual lesson for the individual.
It does, and that is why parables are so endlessly debated. They are kaleidoscopic. A parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, as many have said, but the heavenly meaning can shift depending on the theological lens you look through. However, whether you see the treasure as the individual believer, the universal church, or the nation of Israel, the central action remains identical. An unimaginably high price is paid out of profound joy to secure something deemed priceless.
The emphasis on the field is interesting too. The man does not just grab the treasure and run. He buys the dirt. He buys the mundane, ordinary field to get it. The extraordinary thing inside it. If we look at the interpretation where Christ is the man, it means he redeems the whole world, the physical reality, the mundane elements of human existence, to save the people within it.
That is a profound observation. It pushes back against the Gnostic idea that the physical world is inherently evil and only the spiritual lives. By purchasing the field, the man claims ownership of the earth itself. Theologians often point out that the redemption of Christ is cosmic in scope. It is not just about plucking souls out of a doomed planet, it is about redeeming the creation itself. The treasure is intertwined with the field, and both are purchased.
It forces a reevaluation of what we consider valuable. The current owner of the field had a fortune sitting right under his feet and had no idea. He sold his land for the market rate of dirt, completely unaware of the wealth he was giving away. It is a tragic irony.
The previous owner is the silent tragedy of the parable. It serves as a warning about spiritual blindness. You can be in close proximity to the divine. You can literally own the field where the treasure is buried and still miss it entirely because you never bothered to dig deeper. It requires a disruption of the surface to find what is underneath.
This single verse manages to encapsulate debates about free will, divine sovereignty, atonement, and the nature of joy. Whether it is a call to radical human discipleship or a vivid illustration of a Savior who gives up everything to buy back his creation, the parable of the hidden treasure demands that we assess what we value most. If you found this exploration of biblical interpretation thought-provoking, please share this episode with a friend.